illegitimate governments don't want an educated populace, because if you do not have an educated populace, you could say the world is flat. You could say up is down and down is up, and there is no one to challenge what you are saying and question, or speak truth to power.
Welcome to Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams from Crooked Media. I'm your host, Stacey Abrams. Class is in session. It's back to school season in the United States, and one of the few experiences that unites us all, whether it's a one-room schoolhouse or teeming corridors filled with kids and teachers and staff, is going back to school. Education is the cornerstone of a civil society, especially our society. We rely on a shared belief that learning is valuable, that knowledge can be shared, and in America, that the public good is best served by a public education system that serves us all, regardless of income, geography, or ability. But this year, the backdrop of back to school is grim, as Trump and Republicans have taken aim at this essential pillar of our country, public education. In July, the United States Supreme Court let Secretary of Education Linda McMahon and the Republican Party at the federal, state, and local levels agree to slash the Department of Education by nearly 50%. To translate, Republicans forced already overcrowded, under-resourced schools to absorb bigger class sizes with less money. Kids who need options will now have fewer job training programs, despite the proven need and success of them. And millions of kids will lose special education services that were one of the very reasons the Department of Education and Title I was created. But the carnage doesn't stop there. This intentional destruction of public education eliminates DEI programs to support English as second language learners, LGBTQ+ students, and other vulnerable children. Then we add the Republican mega bill, which could strip 18 million children of access to free school meals. And Project 2025, which foreshadows policies like the end of Head Start programs, which are extraordinarily popular, and the wiping out of 6% of the teaching workforce, primarily in low-income communities. And that's just the start. Because this is all part of their larger plan of gutting the government, beginning with education. You see, step 4 of the 10 steps to autocracy and authoritarianism is all about breaking public trust. If you strip the government of its ability to serve the people, it's easy to convince folks that it simply doesn't work. And when education doesn't work, when public education fails, people start to believe nothing works. And they start to forget what a functioning democracy is supposed to do: deliver for the people. Nothing is more foundational to our shared experience than the ability to learn, which is why our public schools have long been ideological battlegrounds for so many on the right. From their fierce opposition to school integration to their fear of accurate teaching of our nation's history, the right wing has vigorously opposed the fundamental role that public education plays in leveling the playing field and fostering progress because it works. In recent years, emboldened by right-wing politicians across the country, we've seen an escalation in this dynamic, with public schools starved of funding, undermined by voucher programs and school choice designed to finance private discrimination with public dollars. In their version of education, the mass banning of books that talk about the true history of slavery or the existence of the LGBTQIA+ community means the truth is off limits. Brave teachers are muzzled or punished if they try to push back with values of inclusion or accurate information. Yet, even in our worst moments, our public schools promise to educate our children, the next generation of leaders, and prepare them for the future. Yes, we have stumbled in this pursuit, but public education persisted. Doing the work of America means teaching our youngest residents the real and sometimes painful history of this country, making them aware of a wider world and keeping them fed, keeping their schools open, keeping their class sizes small enough so that they can be seen. If we don't do that, we not only lose our children, we lose our future. Authoritarians will teach a new version of America, one where most of our children will be footnotes rather than the authors of our destiny. That's why this week on Assembly Required, we're talking to the people leading the fight for public schools and public education every day. First, we're speaking with Christina Rojas, a veteran public school speech language pathologist in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, about what she's seeing on the ground. Then we'll dive in with our panel, President of the National Education Association, Becky Pringle, and Sheria Smith, Union President representing the employees of the Department of Education. Christina Rojas, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to join us. I mean, you've spent the past 20 years as a public school speech language pathologist, working with elementary schools and particularly with elementary students who are in emotional support programs. And the care, the dedication, the impact that you've had in shaping the next generation is laudable. But your experience also means that you're on the front lines living through the chaos of this Trump/Republican attack on public education. From your perspective as an educator, what's happening? What are you seeing? How is it feeling?
Well, I think when I thought about how I wanted to share what people are going through in the schools, kind of on those front lines, like you mentioned, I thought about painting a picture for you on what it looks like to be a teacher in my school district here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So if you could bear with me as I kind of explain this. If
Please.
you were a teacher, and let's say you have ideally 20 students in your classroom, to be a teacher here, 4 of those students are not going to speak English as their native language. 2 of those students are going to be recent immigrants. 1 is actually going to be a refugee with significant trauma who has a lot of absenteeism because their parents won't let them ride a bus. Because where they're from, buses take you to places that you don't want to go. 4 of those students are going to have significant special education needs. So as the teacher, you need to make sure you're following those IEP goals and supporting every single one of those SDIs. 17 of those 20 students are going to be economically disadvantaged. One of your students, at least, is not going to have a place to live. So that's what is coming into the classroom. And then with that, you're going to have probably about 11 that are very far behind in ELA reading. About 9 of those at least are going to be behind in math. And you're expected to bring those students up while also keeping the ones that are on grade level from falling behind. So that's the job that teachers are supposed to have. But I think right now with the attacks on public education, from funding to school shootings to ICE raids, there's so much more that comes along with that. And I think that's the piece that's weighing on teachers, it's the emotional baggage that comes along with knowing, okay, I need to stand in front of a child in a school shooter situation, but also now I'm going to be expected to also stand in front of an ICE agent. So I think that's the piece that's scary. And then when you look at the defunding, it adds a whole other layer of uncertainty. So this goes beyond just, hey, we want to have locked schools for safety, but where's the emotional safety that we're putting in place for our teachers so that they can be the best for our kids?
What you just painted as a picture is, I think, extraordinary, but would be jarring to most people who presume that all of this is addressed. And one of the conversations we have on the show is about how we translate the expectations that people have into the realities that folks like you and the children that you serve actually live. And one of the conversations we've been having is the conversation about DEI and why this administration and right now this political ideology is so aggressively targeting DEI. And in your painting of your picture, you highlighted what I want to dive into on a few levels. So when we say DEI, one of the most significant DEI advances made in this country was the creation of the Department of Education, the creation of Title I, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. and you referenced IEPs and SDIs. Can you talk a little bit about why gutting DEI has an effect on those students?
Absolutely. I mean, I can speak a little bit more to the funding specifically for my district. I think we get close to, I want to say about $2 million to be able to fund some of these programs like Title I, Title III, Title IV, but also access funding is huge for our kids. So that goes for paraprofessionals, busing. The thing is, what's beautiful about public schools is that we don't shut our doors to anyone. Every child, regardless of what zip code they live in, what they look like, our schools are open for them. And then when you take out the legs from our schools to be able to provide these mandated resources, we're kind of left with, what are we supposed to do? In my state alone, our state legislators are kind of at an impasse because the conversation to push vouchers is holding up our funding. There's about $1.7 billion being held up in Pennsylvania right now because there's a tax on public education. And it doesn't make sense. When we look at it, like for our homes, we have public funded police and fire to protect your home. If you want something extra, security, whatever it is, you pay for it yourself. It's not on my neighbor to provide these extra services that I just want for my home. And I think that same philosophy applies to school. It's fine if you want to have a private education for your child, but taxpayer funds should not follow discrimination. It should not go to places that provide, a education on a silver platter, but with a student body that doesn't represent the demographic of our school community. Taxpayer funds need to go in public schools. And I think that simple philosophy seems to be lost on a lot of people, and I'm not really sure why.
Well, one of the more alarming changes that we've seen, and I appreciate you being so specific, but also so compassionate in this conversation, because one of the pieces we've seen in this Republican decimation of public education is the decision to move special education oversight from the Department of Education to Health and Human Services, where the anti-science secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has already demonstrated his, I think, apathy towards the health of our children by attacking vaccines and lauding basically the breakdown of science and knowledge. What impact could this have for students with autism, ones who are neurodivergent or who otherwise have learning differences and need the kind of tailored support that you and your colleagues provide?
Cutting funding and switching over oversight to a department that isn't based in education is very concerning. I think that's part of the problem that we've seen already when we have people who are not educators, who don't have their feet in the ground and rooted in education making decisions. I mean, that's why we have state testing that is culturally and economically biased determining funding. It doesn't make sense. And so that move also doesn't make sense. We are going to have people who don't understand and who aren't connected, as you said, to science and to reality, making decisions that are going to impact our kids. And I wish people came into our schools. I think that's the thing that needs to happen. I wish we had more people who want to make decisions actually come in and see what's happening rather than believing kind of the rhetoric that's spun on different media sites and I don't know if you want to call them news organizations, opinion organizations, that are funneling this narrative that we're failing here when we're not. We are doing amazing things. Public schools work. What's failing is our government, and what's failing are the people that are taking the legs out from underneath us. And yet we're still moving forward. We're still meeting our kids where they are. And I'm so proud of what public educators are doing across this country. And I really would just say, please come in and see. Please come in and try to do this job. We need subs. I would love for some of our politicians and our decision makers to show up and see what they're doing to our kids.
Well, I love two things you said. One is that public school works. That just should be the bumper sticker that folks have everywhere. I am the product of public education, and public education saved our lives. It saved my parents' lives. It saved my life and my siblings' lives. And this idea that public school doesn't work has always been just not just defeatist, it's been incendiary. And so I'm so grateful you said that. And one of the things we do on Assembly Required is try to give people homework. And I think one homework assignment that we should offer to every state legislator and every school board member and every city council member and mayor and executive is that they have to be subs for one day in a public school.
Yes, I would love that. That is the answer.
Well, I want to talk about something else you just referenced, which is how different the lived experience of public school is from how teachers, educators, and students experience it. We know that often in the policy focus for students, the focus is on how policy affects their learning, their safety, and ostensibly their emotional and their physical well-being. When we come to educators, it's often a conversation about low wages, long hours, and the challenges of organizing and advocating for yourselves. But as you and I both know, these more often than not intersect as struggles that are mutually reinforcing. And if we solve one, we could solve the other. How do you think about the responsibility of how we bring these two things together, especially in light of these Republican policies that are attacking public education at the federal, state, and local levels?
I think one thing that first came to mind when we were talking about the perceptions of what people are living versus what is happening on the national stage. I think when we think about gun reform, like policy in terms of gun in our country, and we think about school shootings, people hear that. They see what's happening on the news. But I don't know if they all realize the training that we have to get as educators and the training that we're giving our kids. One of the programs that we use here is called HERO, and the acronym stands for Hide, Escape, Run, and Overcome. And what's crazy is the O for overcome is at that point, we have to train our kids to pick up books, staplers, whatever you can find in the room and throw it at the shooter, because that's now that shooter is in the room. We have a K-4 program here in my school. They are learning HERO. So why are our leaders in this country not standing up to defend us? We are here to educate kids. They are here to learn and be safe. It shouldn't be our job to also fight these lunatics that are coming in and doing this. So that's one piece. But I think the attacks on collective bargaining are huge. We want to have wages and working conditions that make us able to be independent in our communities. We want to have healthcare that keeps us working and safe and healthy. We also want to have pensions that allow us to have dignity as we get older. So all of these things have only happened because of unions. And they're only going to continue with collective bargaining power. You know, unions, we know, made the middle class. But I think what we have to get back to is in order to rebuild the middle class, we have to, unionize, and we have to protect collective bargaining rights. And I think that's huge. And it's not about greedy teachers. That is not the case. Classroom, teachers are the ones that are filling in the gaps. We are the ones buying food. It goes beyond pencils and erasers. I mean, we are buying clothes. We are buying sanitary napkins for our teen girls. 90% of the kids in my school district, we have 10,000 students, 90% are economically disadvantaged. School lunches and what's offered here only goes so far. And so, we can write off $300 on our tax returns for what we're buying. That's nothing compared to the second or third homes or yachts that the super rich get to write off. But, I think we're forgetting that it's so much beyond that. The amount of money that we put into because we want to, because we are here for the kids, and we will figure it out, and we will fill in the gaps. We will teach them to throw books and staplers, but that doesn't mean that's the way it should be. And that's where I call on our leaders to actually stand up and lead.
Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by Wild Alaskan Company. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, where seafood is a staple and the catch of the day is always right at your fingertips. My parents now live close to me in Atlanta, miles away from the Gulf Coast, and a good day of fishing. That's why I'm glad I can send them boxes from Wild Alaskan Company. Wild Alaskan Company is a terrific way to get wild-caught, perfectly portioned, nutrient-dense seafood delivered directly to your door. My parents love the convenience of having a variety of great seafood land right on their doorstep. They like cooking for the whole family, and right now they are really enjoying trying out the Pacific rockfish and sockeye salmon. The fish from Wild Alaskan Company is 100% wild caught, never farmed. This means there are no antibiotics, GMOs, or additives. Just clean, real fish that support healthy oceans and fishing communities. Wild Alaskan fish is frozen off the boat to lock in taste, texture, and nutrients like omega-3s. And it's sustainably sourced. Wild caught from Alaska, every order supports sustainable harvesting practices. And your membership delivers flexible shipments, expert tips, and truly feel-good seafood. Try it risk-free. If you're not completely satisfied with your first box, Wild Alaskan Company will give you a full refund. No questions asked, no risk, just high-quality seafood. Not all fish are the same. Get seafood you can trust. Go to wildalaskan.com/assembly for $35 off your very first box of premium wild-caught seafood. That's wildalaskan.com/assembly for $35 off your first order. And thank you to Wild Alaskan Company for sponsoring this episode. Assembly Required is brought to you by bookshop.org. Whether you're looking for that last great summer read before the leaves turn, or a thought-provoking book about local history that teaches you something new about your community, bookshop.org has you covered. I'm rereading Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau and diving into the novel If You Love It, Let It Kill You by Hannah Petard, both ordered using bookshop.org. When you purchase from bookshop.org, you're supporting more than 2,000 local independent bookstores across the country, ensuring they'll continue to foster culture, curiosity, and a love of reading for generations to come. And exciting news for those of you with an e-reader. Bookshop.org has launched an ebook app. You can now support local, independent bookstores even when you read digitally. Use code STACY to get 10% off your next order at bookshop.org. That's code STACY at bookshop.org. When you think about where your power as an educator runs into the power of policymakers to decide what you can do, what's your call to action for parents and for just good people in your community? What do you need them to be doing right now to help you navigate this disconnect that you're describing?
I think two things. I think we need to talk to each other again and not continue to give into the social media divide that's kind of happened across the country. I mean, as a speech pathologist, I'm always going to favor communication. I'm always going to favor putting down devices, especially for our youngest ones, and talking to each other. And I think that's huge. And I think we have to get back to that because we have to remember the relationships that we have with each other and what's so important. And those relationships are what get us through those tough times and those tough conversations. We need to come together and remember that we are all Americans. We love this country, and we need to come together to continue to make it better and actually make it great by coming together. But I think the call to action would be to really own our power, to own the power of voting and holding our legislators and our leaders accountable. Because I think people are getting so overwhelmed and inundated with news and the negative that they almost feel like, well, it doesn't matter. And I think that's the missing piece, is that so many of us all have these basic needs. We all believe kids should be able to come to their public schools. They should be able to be safe. They should be able to get the education. We should give teachers the tools that they need. But our legislators don't seem to be hearing that. And I think having sensible gun reform, having sensible, cyber charter school reform, these things are not radical ideas. And I think if we just talk to each other to get the understanding of why this is important, and then showing up all the way, not just when it comes time to vote for president, but at your local level. Yes. People forget how important school boards are. They are huge. People always want to blame the teacher on what's going wrong. And they're not realizing it's not even the principal that gets to make decisions. It is the school board who's making these decisions. And so we have to see, if you don't want certain things happening in your city, well, who's on your city council? I'm asking on behalf of fellow educators for your vote.
So let me know where I need to send my vote and my check. I think what you've just described is one of the cornerstones for how we save our democracy, but more importantly, how we build the country we say we want. And one of the other flags that you raised earlier was the issue of technology and how that intersects with communication. There's the technology that's been used to fracture us, but we also know that in our schools, technology has become both a boon and a harm. We see more and more schools beginning to address device usage and the effect it has on children. But at the same time, we know that educators are grappling with the impact of AI and the effect that has on learning and development. What are you seeing? And as a speech pathologist and as an educator, what do you wish we were talking about more, thinking about more?
Oh, man. I think for me, the big piece is being able to keep devices out of our youngest kids' hands. As a speech pathologist, we need to talk to our kids again. I mean, I see so many kids who are just barely even able to hold the cell phone, and they're on it. And we already know that there is research out there that supports that kids really shouldn't be in front of devices before the age of 3. But I think talking to each other in the car, talking to each other at the grocery store, talking to each other at home, we're missing that now. Our kids are not hearing the examples of their parents having a rational discourse. They don't know how to do that because they're not seeing it anymore. And so then they come to school and, they're not coming in with those basic oral language skills. And then we're expecting them to be able to write. We're expecting them to be able to read when oral language is huge for literacy. And so I think if we put the devices down, it would help us as a society for our youngest learners, but also as people to be able to communicate, see each other again, and talk about what's really important. And then we can actually build those relationships. And that is what's going to get us through those hard times. We are so isolated and getting so disconnected by our devices. And I think that's what we're seeing in school. Yes, we want our kids to be innovative. We want them to be ready for the jobs of the future. There is a time and a place for that. As a speech pathologist, some of our kids use devices to speak, and that is their voice. That's a little different than constantly having teachers use devices for things. But again, I think that's where people need to remember they can show up at their school boards. As a taxpayer in your community, you can go to every single one of your school board meetings. You can ask them about the policies that they're approving or denying. And that's where I think people need to take the power back.
As a speech pathologist, I mean, what you just said about the importance of actually engaging your children, having those conversations, how that is so foundational to their literacy, but also their socialization. What's the one policy that you would recommend everyone listening who says, I'm going to do this one thing, I'm going to go to the school board and I'm going to ask for this policy? What's the most effective policy? Not the most complicated, but if they could ask for one thing, what's the thing you want them to ask for?
I think at the end of the day, asking the school board members, how often do you sub in the schools? How often have you been in the classroom in a meaningful way? Have you ever stepped in and covered for an hour so that, various teachers can actually go to the bathroom during the day, so that people can actually get a lunch? I would encourage the same thing for our legislators. If they want to speak to what's going on in our schools, hold them accountable to actually being and knowing what's happening in our schools.
Christina Rojas, when you decide to put your name on the ballot, count me in. Thank you so much for your time here today on Assembly Required.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Both of you have spent years in education. Becky as a former middle school teacher, now serving as NEA president, which I would say was probably really good training. And Sheria as a former elementary school teacher, now an attorney with the Office for Civil Rights and the union president representing the Department of Education. And I would say that you were probably overqualified for your job.
It's like most Black women.
We are seeing, though. I was just saying, going from elementary school to dealing with lawyers, that's not a one-to-one transition.
I take elementary school.
Yeah. You both have done such extraordinary work in your roles leading up to this dramatic change that we saw happen in our country starting in January. And in particular, we have seen this alarming rise of attacks on public education that Trump is elevating, but we've watched this happen with Republicans for years, from attempts to dictate what gets taught in schools, to massive funding cuts, to executive orders that are geared towards dismantling the Department of Education and a court decision that said it could do so. I know there's a lot for us to cover, but before I get into the depths, I want to really talk about background and anchoring why this matters so much, why people who think that public education is important but isn't vital to saving democracy, tell them why. What's the language they need to use to explain why education, why public education is a center of how democracy works?
Stacey, I'm glad you added the word public. And the reason I say that is because our democracy here in the United States of America is like other democracies around the world and throughout time. It is access to a universal, free education for all. That is public education. And we know that public education is the foundation of a democracy. The ability for every child in this country to have access to a high quality education, to be able to learn to think critically and work in collaboration with other students and educators to solve the wicked problems that we have today, and certainly those that they will encounter into the future. That's all a part of being a democracy. Being prepared to ask your government those tough questions. And we know that this administration wants no part of that. They do not want a highly educated citizenry because they don't want people asking questions and becoming a discerning public. And so necessarily they, like any society or government, pick one, any place in this world throughout history, you can always see that trajectory of their rise and their fall. And as soon as they start taking away the right of their citizens to learn, that's when they begin to falter. That's when an authoritarian regime starts to lose its foothold. And so it's why throughout history, educators themselves specifically, and unionists, Sheria, specifically too, have an outsized role to play in sounding the alarm, using our voices to do that, telling real stories about real students who are impacted, educating the broader public about what's actually going on. And then as unionists, taking the kind of action to mobilize, to organize and mobilize in a way that we actually can do everything possible to beat back that reign, that rise toward unfettered access to power and money.
Well, Sheria, I want to follow up on that and ask you to build on what Becky has said and talk about this in the context of why we have, and more importantly, why we need a fully functioning Department of Education.
Yeah, I will say my coworkers and I, we've been very confused by these attacks because, we're do-gooders. Why would anyone not want us to be performing our jobs? I actually worked at some major law firms before where I worked for the man. And I can understand why people would not want high-powered lawyers making it easier for banks to foreclose or what have you. But what I don't understand, and what none of my colleagues understand, is why you do not want working people, and that's who we are, helping other working people. So the functions of the Department of Education are twofold. One, we provide funding. We provide funding to schools. We provide funding to states. We provide funding to our fellow American citizens who are trying to obtain, their education and improve their status in life. We also provide oversight. Now, you might have your suspicions about who would not want oversight. They're generally the bad actors. But I think most of us would want to make sure that schools are doing right by our kids. We would want to make sure if we send our kids to schools that they're not going to be mistreated because of their race. We want to make sure that, if we send our kids to the school and they require extra time on a test or another accommodation, that they will receive their accommodations. That is the work of the U.S. Department of Education. And, Becky is so right. As unionists, it is important for us to be myth busters and to speak truth to power. And a big myth that's been created is about what we do in that agency. And Becky and her members can attest, we do not have control over the curriculum that's happening in classrooms. That's controlled by the states. We are not responsible for whether or not students are testing well. That's controlled by the states. What we did do before they fired all of our people is we analyzed those test scores to say, hey, these are what we can improve upon. These are, where we're good at. This is where we rank amongst the world. And so when you fire people who are, analyzing the data, if you're firing the people who are providing oversight, if you are firing people who are providing the funding that is needed to have the programs that you and your children rely on, that is an attack on the American people. And that allows an illegitimate government, much like the governments that, every other government that attacks education, to make up the facts for themselves.
Well, both of you have referenced legitimacy in government, authoritarianism, and I've been having this conversation over the last few weeks and intend to keep having it, which is that there are 10 steps in the autocrat's playbook, in the authoritarian playbook. And step 4 is that you break government so it doesn't work for anyone. And then there's step 8, which says that you go after those who would help protect the vulnerable. And so when I think about those two and then inserted in the middle of step 7, and that's when you go after the vulnerable, the marginalized, the disadvantaged, you go after DEI. And by attacking education, this is a moment where not only attacking education, public education as a central good, but also attacking the Department of Education and its workers and the dismantling of the work of the Department of Education. It's like it's a bank shot. You get all 3 for the price of 1. And so, Becky, I want to start with you here. We know that this administration is picking up on years and years of state-led attacks on public education with this trope that I think, Sheria, you were just dismantling, which is that it's necessary because funding should be left to the states, not the federal government, that decisions should be left to the states. Can you talk a little bit for our audience about what has happened when that power shifts to local governments without the oversight of the federal government and without a federal mandate for public education for all 50 states and territories and such?
So, Stacey, at the end of the 60s, as part of the civil rights movement, education, of course, was a part of that. And the original enacting of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was a byproduct of the civil rights movement to say very clearly that the government had a role to play. The federal government had a role to play in ensuring that every student had access and opportunity and resources. That specifically was focused on those students who came from families that had lower incomes. It specifically was focused, and though broadened when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed, but it did begin that focus on students with disabilities. The role of federal government was to ensure that regardless of where you lived, your zip code, that you would have access. But as Sheria said, the responsibility of curriculum and the lion's share of the funding comes from the states. But in those particular places where the federal government must play a larger role to try to get at the equity of access and opportunities, that's where our students are suffering, are already and will continue to suffer the most. But we have seen throughout time, when the federal government does not play that role in defending issues of equity and access, that too often states do not. But we know that the states will suffer because of the big, bad, terrible, really horrible, no good bill that was passed in every way. And one of the first things to go after in terms of taking away funding is public education and the students at most risk, those who have historically been marginalized. They will be the ones that will be impacted first.
You know, this attack on public education is so far reaching because there is not just the public funds that they're withholding from states. It is also the funds they're withholding from colleges and universities that train qualified teachers. You know, we have an administration that is now saying that historically, you know, Hispanic serving institutions are unconstitutional, and we know that that is just a canary in the coal mine. They're not going to stop with HSIs. They are going to continue to HBCUs. They've already attacked, you know, larger research universities. And the first things that are going to go are financial aid to people who do not come from wealth. And I'm a former teacher. I need a college degree. I went to Harvard to teach my fifth grade students. And I think my fifth grade students were benefited from, you know, my education. You are going to stop the pipeline of talented teachers in the classroom. You're also, with the elimination of, you know, our largest division, federal student aid, you are taking away the student loan forgiveness for those people who would be entering the classroom. So it's not just an attack on current funding. They are attacking working people down the line. They are preventing qualified and educated working people to then educate the next generation.
The Supreme Court of the United States gave the Secretary of Education the authority to slash half of the Department of Education. And you've just given us a handful of some of the impacts. And I want you to talk for a second more about vulnerable students who are in low-income communities, you know, students with disabilities in particular. Talk a little bit more about why these cuts are so dramatic. And I think tying it back to what Becky was saying about the nature of the federal government in protecting these students. Can you talk a bit about what you're seeing happen because of these cuts?
Yeah, so, you know, this gets to an earlier point you made about how this administration is doing a three-pronged attack, like three birds in one fell swoop. So you're cutting the employees who themselves are recipients of public funds. I'm a recipient of Pell Grants, who have children. You're cutting their jobs. And their jobs happen to justify, you know, be the data analyzers that justify why certain school districts or certain HBCUs need more funding or how well the funding is working. You are then cutting out the people who would provide oversight to make sure that those funds are being used appropriately and used to help all Americans, not just those who might identify with politically with certain people. So when you cut people from those jobs, it allows this administration to make things up. So then they can say, oh, you know what, we're slashing these budgets because they weren't useful anyway. And there's no one to check. There's no one to provide oversight to say, wait a minute, no, you know, you can make effects. The current Secretary of Education is right now doing a nationwide tour of schools. And she just left Mississippi, which is a state I know you're from, Stacey. My grandparents are from. She announced that Mississippi is leading the country in literacy. And she announced that before school even started in the state of Mississippi. So how would you know that they're leading in literacy? What data points are you even referring to make that statement? So this is why, you know, myth busting is so important. And challenging what is being said to you, it explains why illegitimate governments don't want an educated populace, Because if you do not have an educated populace, you could say the world is flat. You could say up is down and down is up, and there is no one to challenge what you are saying, and question, or speak truth to power. And they're going to begin to tell us anything. So they'll begin to tell us, oh, well, there are no vulnerable students. They can tell you anything. And if you're a parent, you're like, wait, my kid can't read. Oh, that's great. That's like they are meeting all the metrics.
And I think that goes to this larger conversation about the $7 billion in education programs that were cut at the beginning of the school year. And earlier I referenced, step 4 is you break government so it doesn't work. So you break public education. And then I talked about step 8. And one of the parts of step 8 is that you have to have a civil society that steps in. And one of the most important parts of that are our unions. And I want to just lift up for this moment that when that happened, when that $7 billion in education programs were paused, it was money that was forced to be released thanks to the efforts of organized educators like yourselves and your allies. So, Becky, what would have happened if that $7 billion had stayed paused?
So, from after school programs being cut to meeting the specific needs of our students with IEPs, individualized education programs, our students with disabilities, to summer school, to the amount of educators that we have, and not just teachers. We're talking about counselors, and we're talking about nurses. We're talking about food service workers. We're talking about bus drivers, which, by the way, it was during the pandemic that people started realizing how important it was that we had the people to get the kids to school. And when we didn't, when we had we still have a shortage, then their bus routes became longer and kids were on buses for over 2 hours, which is unacceptable. That's an unacceptable way to start and end their day. So we're talking about all educators being impacted by that. But Stacey, that $7 billion, because a lot of people will say, well, they released it, they unfroze it, so why are you complaining about that now? It's people who haven't spent a day in a classroom or in a school that don't understand the chaos they inflicted on educators, parents, and students right towards the end of a school year. And, I can remember when it happened, and Sheria, I know you feel this because it's just like the beginning of school every year. I'm not in the classroom right now, but I still feel the excitement and the anticipation because it's back to school, right? And you never lose that. The same thing is when you're closing down a school year. You're getting ready to go into summer. You're trying to make sure the kids have what they need. You're meeting with parents. You're doing all these things. You're meeting with your colleagues and administrators, planning for the next year. And all of a sudden, boom, the president's saying he's taking $7 billion away. So now you are already starting the work for the next school year. The administrators are already making decisions about whether they can keep the number of educators on. So they're immediately going into riffing teachers in that mode. All that happened while the rest of the world wasn't paying attention. All of that chaos happened for 3 weeks. You can't undo that damage. You can't undo that damage because then educators and students were going off to the summer and they weren't there together to try to plan for that next year. And it's exactly, Stacey, what you lay out with your 10 steps. It is chaos and confusion. It's deliberate, and it doesn't just go away because somebody says, oh, okay, I didn't mean that. It still lingers, and it lingered as we went back to school because of decisions that were made that then they had to undo and redo it. So unions like ours and Sheria's are, of course, standing up and speaking out. And one of the things that we, certainly as educators, realized we had to do was to make sure that our educators understood how powerful their stories were. And then to actually provide them with the training so that they could learn how to tell those stories of real students and real parents and real schools and how it was going to impact the people who don't even know how much they depend on Medicaid. They don't even understand that in their rural area, the impact that's going to happen from that bill. They don't understand that. But we have to make sure that educators and parents and the students themselves, by the way, can tell those stories so they can make the connection back to this administration.
We celebrated when you all were able to block that $7 billion. But Sheria, we know that last Monday, House Republicans proposed a 15% cut to DOE's budget for the 2026 fiscal year. And we know the Senate is considering a different plan that would mostly maintain the current discretionary funding, but doesn't add anything. So Sheria, can you just pick up on what Becky was saying? Like, if this cut does pass, what will be the impact, and is there a way to fight it?
Yeah, what you have as a unionist is intentional infliction of emotional distress on working people. So Becky spoke a little bit about teachers not being able to prepare or not even knowing if they're going to have jobs because of the interruption of funding. I will say that happened to our workforce months before. That happened to our workforce in January, where they started day one placing people on leave for suspected DEI activity, then telling everyone, well, you might as well quit because we're going to get rid of the funding. We're going to eliminate your agency. And so, they fired in February many of our probationary employees. Still to this day, we don't know why they were fired. We don't know why the people were placed on leave because of suspected DEI activity. We have not been told what DEI work they actually performed and why their counterparts who had the same jobs were not placed on leave. Then certainly in March, they did a reduction in force for over half of our workforce, threatened to eliminate our jobs and our ability to take care of our families in June. Luckily, with solidarity from other unions, we got a lawsuit to stop that until August 1st. But when you have these continued attacks and threats to your jobs, and this funding, deficit is just another one. So they've had to reinstate people that they put on leave or that they fired in February, much like they had to start giving the funding to states. But the damage is already done. The intentional infliction of emotional distress is already done, and they're continuing on with it, with threats to further defund our agency so then they can actually conduct a legitimate reduction in force. And so you have talented people who dedicated their lives to serve the public, to help other working people obtain an education, shell-shocked, wondering, even though I've been reinstated by this litigation, how long will my job last? Should I be, will I be able to pay my mortgage or pay my rent? And so what is happening with federal employees? And, I want to really emphasize that this is happening to federal employees that should be the most protected in this country. And if this is happening to us, it is no surprise that has happened to, what has happened to teachers this summer. And I think that's a reflection of what is going to happen to other working people in this country. And that is the importance of unions. To our core, we represent working people. So when we're talking about defunding a federal agency that you have already ran through the ringer emotionally, fired the people only to rehire them 6 months later, where the work is all, backed up. And so some of the people that, cases that we were handling, many of those students have graduated. So we can't even give them relief because you put us on ice for 7 months. That is what I anticipate is going to happen to more and more working people in this nation. And it starts with, unfortunately, it started with us.
Sheria, and thank you for bringing that up, the emotional distress, because, this administration doesn't want to talk about that as though these aren't real people that this happened to. I had a reporter ask me a question, Sheria. He said, so do you think the federal workers will come back if they give them their jobs back? And like I could answer that question. I know what I wanted to say, but I did not say that, Sheria. I didn't say that out loud into the microphone. But, I am from Philly, so I could say some things. But I did take the time to emphasize the horrible way that people were treated. We were in the streets with you, Sheria, and I attended several of those rallies, and I will never forget being beside Anthony, a veteran, who told his story through tears, Yes, through tears, how excited he was to get this job, to give back. That we are forgetting these are public service workers. He was so excited to give back because he was able to go to college because of what the federal government did for him. He was so excited, and they just summarily dismissed him. Just dismissed him in that disrespectful email with no explanation and so we can't forget that human element. And I just wanted to thank you for putting that into this conversation.
Well, Becky, I want to pick up on the human element piece because I want both of you to talk about, your years as public educators. You understand firsthand what it looks like when a student hasn't eaten or is struggling with severe hunger. And now we have 18 million children who risk not having enough to eat throughout the school day. Becky, you and I have talked about the impact that this elimination of school meals will have. Can you talk a bit about it from your vantage point, formerly as a teacher and now as someone who's helping guide so many educators in the classroom?
So, when most of us hear the number $186 billion cut from the SNAP program, we can't even imagine that, right? And so one of the things that's really important, and we've worked with our members on, is we did all of the gathering of information and research, Stacey, and put together state by state and drilling down to congressional district by congressional district. What does that mean? So that people can actually wrap their heads around what $186 billion cuts will mean in these are your kids, your families, your schools, your communities. And this is what it will mean so that they can talk about it from that place. And it's because of these cuts that when I put together my back to school tour last week, I said to my team, I want to go to places where the community is doing its very best to stand in these gaps the best they can. And yes, that's what it's about, right? Community, come together. It's our shared responsibility. When we say every student, if we mean every student, then we have to share that responsibility. But that the gaps have gotten bigger and they've gotten greater. So more students and families have fallen into the gaps, not less. So right now, we know that this year, our teachers are spending upwards to $500 out of their own pockets to try to fill in gaps. We can't fill these chasms. It's not possible. So I visited Alhambra, California, where our local union set up a food bank. And the need was so great, the union couldn't continue to do it. And so they reached out to the city council and they helped to try to fund it. So now they have this incredible food pantry that's feeding kids and families, by the way, kids and families. That's what we learned in the pandemic. It's all of them, not just the kids. And they said how the last big drive, they had over 2,000 people show up. They had to turn away 300 families. 300 families. I've been saying, who doesn't want to feed the babies? Who doesn't want to feed the babies? We know who doesn't want to feed the babies. As educators, Sheria and you and I know that kids can't learn if they come to school hungry. And if their entire family is hungry, we know that when they go home and they need that support from their families are just struggling to try to find something to put food on the table. So it is unacceptable. And those are the kinds of things that we need that we are working with members and parents and community organizations, faith organizations, all of us coming together and saying, yes, we will pitch in, we'll do our part, but that should never say to the federal government, that's the way it should be. No. They have made a promise to our kids, and they need to keep it.
Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by Mosh. I'm always looking for ways to take better care of myself and be thoughtful about what I eat, especially since I'm usually on the go. Now I've found a protein snack that satisfies both goals, Mosh bars. Mosh, which you may have heard about on Shark Tank, was founded by Maria Shriver and her son, Patrick Schwarzenegger, with a simple mission: to create a conversation about brain health through food, education, and research. Maria's father suffered from Alzheimer's, And since then, she and Patrick have dedicated themselves to finding ways to help other families dealing with this debilitating disease. Mosh joined forces with the world's top scientist and functional nutritionist to go beyond your average protein bar. Each Mosh bar is made with ingredients that support brain health, like ashwagandha, lion's mane, collagen, and omega-3s, plus a game-changing, brain-boosting ingredient you won't find in any other bar. Mosh is the first and only food brand boosted with cognizin, a premium nootropic that supplies the brain with a patented form of acetylcholine. Mosh bars actually taste great and come in 9 mouthwatering flavors, including 3 new plant-based flavors: chocolate chip cookie, hazelnut chocolate chip, and peanut chocolate chip. But here's the best part to make you feel good. Mosh donates a portion of all proceeds from your order to fund gender-based brain health research through the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. Why gender-based? 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women. Mosh is working closely to close the gap between women and men's health research. Maintaining a brain-healthy diet while also juggling multiple projects like Assembly Required and my book tour can be a challenge. But having Mosh bars on hand means one less thing to worry about. Just keeping 1 or 2 in my bag every day means that I can have a delicious, satisfying snack handy. If you want to find ways to do good and fuel your body and your brain, Mosh bars are the perfect choice for you. Head to moshlife.com/assembly to save 20% off plus free shipping on the Bestsellers Trial Pack or the new plant-based Trial Pack. That's 20% off plus free shipping on either the Bestsellers Trial Pack or the plant-based Trial Pack at moshlife.com/assembly. And thank you, Mosh, for sponsoring this episode. Sheria, I want to come to you and talk about another aspect of this administration. And I say Trump and Republicans, because everything that his administration is doing could be blocked by an act of Congress that says, no, you cannot. And yet they are complicit. And so I'm being very intentional with my language in a way I know neither of you can be. Or you both are, but what I want to talk about here is, we know that today, we're filming this on a Monday, the Supreme Court has just said that it is permissible to stop and abduct people on the streets because they are suspected of being immigrants. We know that as part of the immigration sweeps that have happened so far, ICE agents have been stationed outside of public schools. They've already arrested 2 New York City high schoolers who were dreamers, and a Los Angeles high school student with special needs was detained, among others. And what this decision said, this was on the shadow docket, so there's no real explanation. It says that race and ethnicity, as well as speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, can be used as predicates to stop and detain, which you and I both know means stop and abduct. And so, Sheria, as an attorney, what can public schools do, and what can allies of public schools do to help safeguard these children against these arrests?
I think this situation illustrates the danger of an arbitrary administration. It illustrates the danger of not having oversight. You don't have anyone to check whether or not these abductions or detainments are legitimate. And if they are able to do that with one group of Americans or one group of people, there is nothing to stop this administration from doing it to anyone. And we've seen it historically. There's that famous poem about first they came for the socialists and I didn't do anything because I wasn't a socialist, and then they came for the unionists and I didn't do anything because I was a unionist, so on and so on, and then they came for me. I think all Americans, even though, I can't speak intelligently about what public schools must do, I think as an American, it frightens me to hear about people being detained by ICE without due process, because if that can happen to young children, it is only a matter of time that it'll happen to me. But maybe Becky can speak more intelligently.
Well, you always speak intelligently and defend our rights at every level, Sheria. So first of all, thank you. Here's the thing, Stacey, as I alluded to before, NEA is preparing to join a lawsuit against the government for that exact ruling as it relates to immigration. Schools have always been recognized as one of those safe zones. And now they're expanding those to not only schools, but places of worship, community organizations, really basically anywhere they want to go. And it is up to us to fight, and we're going to use every tool we can to wage that fight. And I want to talk about those specific tools. You have 10, I have 7, Stacey. But before I do, I want to read what Justice Sotomayor said. We should not have to live in a country where the government can seize anyone who looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears to work a low-wage job. Let's just think about that a minute. So we know who they're targeting deliberately with this decision. And she goes on to say, rather than stand idly by while our constitutional freedoms are lost, I dissent. Thank you. Thank you, Justice Sotomayor. But here's the thing. Stacey, as our 7,000 delegates gathered at our annual convention, I said to them, I need you to take action every day. And so I'm going to say to you 7 verbs. 7 verbs. They are action words. I need you to commit to me that you're going to take some kind of action, one or all of these 7 verbs every day. Educate. Communicate, organize, mobilize, litigate, and finally elect, because we have an election coming up. We have lots of elections coming up, let me say, because all of them, from the school board, which is where we're focused right now, we've got to pass policies that are closest to those babies and closest to our communities to try to mitigate all this crazy and stupid and horrible and cruel that's happening to the federal government. So we're very hyper-focused at that level. So I want to say it's just about federal elections, but it certainly is. Absolutely. And that's coming up. And so all of those things. So that's what I've asked my members to do. Take action. 1 or more, 7 verbs every day.
Well, I think that is a perfect place for us to close our conversation, because if not, we will be having this conversation through next week. You two are extraordinary leaders who have lifted up what we need to be doing. Sheria, Becky gave us 7 verbs. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to give us one more call to action. If there's one other thing, you are protecting not just the workers who defend and lead the Department of Education, but all of their constituents. So what's something that you are asking our listeners to do to help support that work?
I think question everything and force the people who are being paid to represent you to actually represent you. So it's not just the voting booths. These people are supposed to work for you every day. And if they are not working for you, if your child is not receiving food, if your child is afraid that they're going to be mistreated, or that their classmate might be mistreated, then you need to make sure that you let your member of Congress and your senators know that bothers you. If your school district is saying, oh, we are missing funding, so we're going to have to raise your property taxes because we're no longer getting that funding from the federal government, you need to raise hell to your member of Congress and your senators. It is their job to work for you 365 days a year. And they don't want you to know that, right? They want you to think, oh, all I have to do is every 4 years I have to vote for them. They are supposed to work for you every day, and you should absolutely make sure that they are doing their job.
You want to call your school board members to make sure they're calling your members of Congress. You want to call your state legislators to make sure they're calling your members of Congress. You want to call your city council members to make sure that they're calling your members of Congress. Everyone who lives in your state who is elected to public office has the responsibility to call on our federal leaders to do their jobs. So Sheria Smith, Becky Pringle, thank you both for what you are doing for people at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, and more importantly, how you are saving public education for the next generation of Americans. So appreciate you both.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you so much, ladies.
As always on Assembly Required, we are here to give you real actionable tools to face today's biggest challenges. So first, be curious. Public education is the cornerstone of democracy, and attacks are becoming increasingly prevalent and terrifyingly successful. To learn more about how these attacks have misled policymakers and parents, read The Death and Life of the Great American School System by Diane Ravitch. Number 2, solve problems. Whether you have children in school or not, protecting public education is a job for all of us. The kids today become our nurses, bankers, and plumbers tomorrow, and we are a better society if they are ready for the world. Everyone should be attending a school board meeting and do at least one before December. Learn more about what's happening and be vigilant. If you're a parent, talk to other parents in your school to raise awareness about the issues. Don't assume everyone knows what's going on. And most importantly, empower your older children to join you in these efforts. Third, let's do some good. Food insecurity will be especially rampant starting this fall. Consider joining up with neighbors to offer weekend food packs for kids, backpacks that include snacks and canned goods to tide children over during the weekends. For more information, visit www.feedingamerica.org and search Backpack Program. As always, if you like what you hear, be sure to share this episode and subscribe on all your favorite platforms. And to meet the demands of the algorithms, please rate the show and leave a comment. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you go to listen and learn. And please also check out my Substack, Assembly Notes, for more information about what we discussed on the podcast and other tools to help us protect our democracy. In the next few weeks, we're going to continue talking about the 10 steps to autocracy and authoritarianism and how to fight back. I'd love to hear more about what you're seeing on the ground. Groups providing mutual aid, innovative neighbors doing extraordinary things, and issues you aren't hearing enough about. If you have a report, a question, or a comment for me, send it in. You can start with an email to assemblyrequired@crooked.com or leave us a voicemail, and you and your questions and comments might be featured on the pod. Our number is 213-293-9509. Well, that wraps up this episode of Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams. Be careful out there, and I'll meet you here next week.